The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of the Naval Academy Preparatory School in Newport, Rhode Island. Cadet Marcus Thompson adjusted his uniform for the third time, making sure every crease was sharp, every button gleaming. At 18, he was one of the top-ranking cadets in his class, known for his attention to detail and unwavering adherence to military protocol. His friends called him Regulation Rick behind his back, though never to his face. Marcus took pride in that nickname, even if he pretended not to know about it. The academy was buzzing with activity that Tuesday morning. It was family day, one of the few times during the year when civilian visitors were allowed on the grounds. Parents, siblings, and sponsors would arrive to see their loved ones in action, to witness the transformation from confused teenagers into disciplined future officers. For the cadets, it was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Everything had to be perfect. Marcus stood with his squad near the main academic building, watching the steady stream of visitors making their way through the security checkpoint. Most were easy to spot: proud mothers clutching cameras, fathers wearing veterans' caps, younger siblings wide-eyed at the military precision surrounding them. They moved in small clusters, following their escorts and speaking in hushed, respectful tones. That's when Marcus first noticed him. The man walked alone, moving across the courtyard with a purpose that seemed different from the other visitors. He was probably in his early 30s, average height, wearing simple civilian clothes, khaki pants, a plain navy blue polo shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing about his appearance screamed military, yet there was something in the way he carried himself that caught Marcus's attention. "You see that guy?" Marcus nudged his roommate, Cadet James Peterson, pointing discreetly toward the lone figure. James squinted in the direction Marcus indicated. "The one in the polo? Yeah, what about him? Doesn't he seem off to you? Like he doesn't belong here?" James shrugged. "Probably just another parent running late. Maybe he got separated from his group or something." But Marcus wasn't convinced. The man's movement was too controlled, too purposeful. He wasn't looking around in wonder like the other civilians. He wasn't taking pictures or trying to spot his cadet among the formations. Instead, he seemed to be studying the facility itself, his eyes taking in details that most visitors would never notice: the security cameras, the positioning of the guard posts, the sight lines from various buildings. "No, there's something wrong here," Marcus insisted, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd been practicing since his first day at the academy. "Look at how he's moving. He's casing the place." The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the small group of cadets. In the post-9/11 world, security threats were always on everyone's mind, especially at military installations. The academy had drilled into them the importance of vigilance, of questioning anything that seemed out of place. Cadet Sarah Kim, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, stepped closer. "Maybe we should report it to the duty officer? Or maybe we should handle it ourselves," Marcus replied, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his ceremonial sidearm. "We're supposed to be the future leaders of the military. This is exactly the kind of situation where we prove we can think on our feet." The man continued his solitary walk, seemingly oblivious to the attention he was drawing from the cadets. He paused near a memorial statue, but rather than reading the inscription like most visitors would, he seemed to be studying the tactical advantages of the position, how it provided cover, the escape routes it offered, the vantage points it commanded. Marcus's suspicions crystallized into certainty. This wasn't a lost parent or a curious civilian. This was someone with training, someone who knew how to read terrain and assess threats. In Marcus's mind, that could only mean one thing: the man was a potential security risk. "Form up," Marcus whispered to his squad. The cadets instinctively moved into a loose formation, their training taking over. They had practiced this scenario dozens of times in their security exercises: how to approach and question suspicious individuals without escalating the situation unnecessarily. The stranger must have sensed their approach because he turned slightly, his eyes scanning the group of cadets now moving toward him. His expression remained neutral, almost bored, as if teenage military students pointing weapons in his direction was just another mundane Tuesday occurrence. Marcus took point, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. His heart pounded with adrenaline and righteous purpose. This was it, his first real test as a future officer, his chance to prove that all the classroom instruction and drill exercises had prepared him for actual leadership in a crisis situation. "Sir, I need you to stop where you are and identify yourself," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. Several other visitors turned to look, creating a growing circle of curious onlookers around the developing confrontation. The man complied, stopping his movement but not turning to face them directly. Instead, he stood at a slight angle, a position that Marcus recognized from his tactical training as one that would allow for quick movement in multiple directions. Another red flag. "Sir, I'm Cadet Thompson, and I need to see some identification," Marcus continued, stepping closer. "You're in a restricted area during a security exercise, and your behavior has been flagged as suspicious." It wasn't technically a security exercise, but Marcus figured the white lie was justified under the circumstances. The important thing was to establish authority and control the situation before it could escalate into something more dangerous. The man finally turned to face them fully, and Marcus got his first clear look at the stranger's face. The features were unremarkable. Brown hair cut short, but not military short. Brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to focus on anything specific. A day's worth of stubble that suggested either laziness or deliberate casualness. But there was something in those eyes, something that made Marcus suddenly feel like he was being studied in return. "Identification," the man repeated, his voice calm and measured. "What kind of identification would you like to see?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Most people, when confronted by armed military personnel, would immediately reach for their wallet or start explaining their presence. This man seemed genuinely curious about what Marcus wanted to see, as if he had multiple forms of identification to choose from and was wondering which would be most appropriate for the situation. "Standard civilian ID," Marcus replied, working to keep his voice steady. "Driver's license, visitor's pass, whatever you've got that shows you have authorized access to this facility." The man nodded slowly, as if Marcus had just passed some kind of test. "Authorized access. That's an interesting phrase. What makes you think I need authorized access?" By now, more cadets had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of their classmate interrogating a civilian. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could sense their expectations. He was the one who had identified the potential threat. He was the one taking charge of the situation. If he backed down now, he'd lose credibility with his peers and potentially allow a real security breach to go unchecked. "Sir, you've been observed conducting what appears to be surveillance of this facility," Marcus stated, his training taking over. "You're moving in patterns consistent with threat assessment, and you're not exhibiting the typical behavior of authorized visitors. I need you to produce identification and explain your presence here immediately." The stranger's lips curved into what might have been the beginning of a smile, though it was hard to tell. "Threat assessment," he repeated. "That's a good observation, Cadet. Very good. But before I show you my identification, let me ask you something." Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. The subject was supposed to comply with reasonable requests, not turn the interaction into some kind of quiz. "Sir, I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to verify your authorization to be on these grounds." "Of course you are," the man agreed. "And you're doing a good job of it, by the way. But humor me for just a moment. In your tactical assessment training, what did they teach you about identifying threats?" The question was so unexpected that Marcus found himself answering before he could think better of it. Threats can be identified by unusual behavior patterns, failure to comply with security protocols, and attempts to gather intelligence through observation or questioning. "Very good. And how would you identify a friendly force operating in civilian clothes?" Marcus hesitated. It was a trick question, and he knew it. But the fact that this civilian was asking such specific questions about military doctrine was itself suspicious. Either the man had some kind of training which supported Marcus's theory about him being a threat, or he was testing them for some reason. "Sir, I really need you to produce that identification now," Marcus said, his voice firming with resolve. "These questions are not helping to resolve the security concern." The man nodded again, that almost smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Fair enough. But let me ask you one more thing before we move on to the ID check." Marcus's patience was wearing thin, and he could sense his fellow cadets growing restless behind him. This was taking too long, getting too complicated. A simple identification check was turning into some kind of philosophical discussion about military doctrine. "What's your question, sir?" The stranger looked directly into Marcus's eyes, and for a moment, the cadet felt something shift in the air around them. It was as if the man had just decided to reveal something that had been hidden, like a mask being removed to show the face underneath. "Do you even know who I am?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Marcus couldn't quite grasp. There was something in the way the man asked it, something in his tone and his posture that suggested the answer mattered more than Marcus could possibly understand. "No, sir, I don't," Marcus replied honestly. "That's why I need to see your identification." The stranger nodded one final time, his expression becoming serious in a way that made Marcus suddenly aware of how quiet the courtyard had become. Even the other visitors seemed to be holding their breath, as if they sensed that something important was about to happen. "All right, cadet," the man said, reaching slowly into his back pocket. "Let me show you exactly who I am." The stranger's hand moved with deliberate slowness as he reached into his back pocket, every movement visible and non-threatening. Marcus kept his eyes locked on a man's hands, his training reminding him that this was the critical moment when any confrontation could turn dangerous. Around them, the gathered crowd of visitors and cadets seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that whatever was about to be revealed would change the nature of this encounter entirely. What the man pulled from his pocket wasn't a standard civilian driver's license or visitor's pass. Instead, he produced a military identification card, but not just any military ID. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the distinctive formatting and security features that marked it as something special. The man held it out toward Marcus, not in the hurried, nervous way most people showed identification when confronted by authority, but with a casual confidence that suggested he was perfectly comfortable with scrutiny. Marcus stepped forward to examine the card, his fellow cadets maintaining their positions behind him. As he got close enough to read the details, his eyes widened, and he felt his stomach drop toward his boots. The name on the ID read Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael Chun, but it was the additional designations printed below the name that made Marcus's hands begin to tremble slightly. SEAL Team 6, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Security clearance levels that Marcus had only heard whispered about in advanced tactical courses. Combat deployment markers that indicated more overseas service than most career officers would see in a lifetime. And at the bottom, a note that made Marcus's mouth go dry. Current assignment in a VSB CWAR training evaluation team. Marcus read the ID 3 times before the full implication sank in. This wasn't just any Navy SEAL. This was a member of the most elite fighting unit in the American military, a warrior from the same team that had conducted the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. And the training evaluation team designation meant he was here officially, conducting some kind of assessment of the Academy's security protocols and cadet readiness. The cadet looked up from the ID to meet Chen's eyes, and what he saw there made him realize just how badly he had misread the entire situation. There was no anger or irritation in the SEAL's expression. Instead, there was something that might have been amusement mixed with professional interest, as if Marcus had just participated in an experiment whose results were being carefully noted. "Senior Chief," Marcus managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know." Chun retrieved his identification with the same casual efficiency he had shown in producing it. "Of course you didn't know, cadet. That was rather the point." The words were spoken without malice, but they carried a weight that made Marcus acutely aware of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. Every aspect of the encounter suddenly took on new meaning. Chen hadn't been conducting surveillance. He had been conducting an evaluation. The seemingly random walking pattern hadn't been an attempt to case the facility for vulnerabilities. It had been a test to see if the cadets would notice and respond to unusual behavior. "You were testing us," Marcus said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Testing is such a formal word," Chen replied. "I prefer to think of it as gathering data." The naval special warfare community has a vested interest in the quality of officers coming up through the pipeline. We like to know what kind of situational awareness and decision-making skills we can expect from our future commanding officers. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized he was being evaluated not just as a cadet, but as a future leader who might one day be responsible for SEAL operations. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the embarrassment of having drawn weapons on one of the military's most elite warriors, made him wish the ground would open up and swallow him whole. "Permission to ask a question, Senior Chief," Marcus said, falling back on military courtesy as his only remaining anchor in this rapidly shifting situation. "Go ahead. How do we do?" Chen's expression grew thoughtful, and he glanced around at the other cadets who had gathered during the confrontation. Marcus followed his gaze and noticed that their little drama had attracted quite an audience. Academy instructors were watching from a distance, clearly aware of what was happening, but choosing not to intervene. Other visitors had their phones out, some apparently recording the interaction, and his fellow cadets were staring at him with expressions ranging from admiration to horror as they processed what had just occurred. "Well," Chen began, "let's start with the positive. You identified unusual behavior and took appropriate action to investigate. Your approach was textbook: maintain distance, request identification, keep your weapon ready but not directly threatening. You followed proper escalation protocols and showed good judgment in not immediately calling for backup." Marcus felt a small surge of relief, but Chen wasn't finished. "However," the SEAL continued, "there are some areas where your assessment could use improvement. You made assumptions based on limited information. You allowed your preconceptions about what a threat should look like to override your actual observations. And, most importantly, you failed to consider alternative explanations for the behavior you witnessed." The criticism stung because Marcus knew it was accurate. He had seen a civilian acting strangely and immediately jumped to the conclusion that the man must be a threat. It never occurred to him that the behavior might have a perfectly legitimate explanation. "In the real world," Chen continued, "these kinds of mistakes can have serious consequences. The ability to quickly and accurately assess threats is crucial for any military leader, but so is the ability to recognize when something that appears threatening is actually friendly. In special operations, we call it the gray zone, situations where the line between friend and foe isn't immediately clear." Marcus nodded, absorbing the lesson. Around them, he could see other cadets leaning in to hear Chen's impromptu instruction session. This was the kind of real-world insight they rarely got in their regular classes. "Senior Chief, may I ask what specifically you were looking for when you conducted your data gathering?" Chen smiled, and for the first time since the encounter began, it reached his eyes. "Good question. I was interested in several things. Response time, how quickly you identified and reacted to unusual behavior. Escalation control, whether you could maintain authority without creating unnecessary conflict. Team dynamics, how your fellow cadets supported your lead or failed to do so. And decision-making under pressure, whether you could adapt when the situation didn't unfold according to your expectations." Marcus glanced back at his teammates, wondering how their performance had measured up. Cadet Peterson had backed his play without question, which showed good unit cohesion. Cadet Kim had suggested involving the duty officer, which demonstrated appropriate recognition of chain of command. But they had all been just as quick to assume the worst about Chen's presence as Marcus had been. "There's something else you should understand," Chen continued. "This kind of evaluation isn't unusual. Special operations units regularly conduct assessments of conventional forces and officer training programs. We need to know that the leaders coming up through the system understand the unique requirements of unconventional warfare." The statement carried implications that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. The idea that elite military units were actively evaluating future officers added a whole new dimension to his understanding of military hierarchy and professional development. "Senior Chief, can I ask about the combat deployment markers on your ID? Are those from—" Chen's expression became more serious. "Some things we don't discuss in public, Cadet. But I can tell you that anyone wearing the SEAL Trident has earned the right to be here. We've all made sacrifices for the privilege of serving in special operations. The indirect answer told Marcus everything he needed to know. This man had seen real combat, had participated in operations that made headlines around the world. The casual confidence that Marcus had initially found suspicious was actually the bearing of someone who had faced life and death situations and emerged victorious. Now, Chin said, let me ask you something. What do you think the most important quality is for a future SEAL officer? Marcus considered the question carefully. Physical fitness was obviously important, as was tactical knowledge and leadership ability. But, given the context of their encounter, he suspected Chun was looking for something more specific. Situational awareness? Marcus ventured. That's important, but not the most important. Decision-making under pressure? Also crucial, but still not what I'm looking for. Marcus thought harder, considering everything that had happened during their confrontation. Chen had remained calm throughout the entire encounter, had turned a potentially embarrassing situation into a learning opportunity, and had maintained control without ever raising his voice or showing irritation. Adaptability? Marcus guessed. The ability to adjust your approach when the situation changes? Chen nodded approvingly. Very good. In special operations, no plan survives contact with reality. The ability to adapt, to think on your feet, to turn unexpected developments into tactical advantages. That's what separates effective operators from casualties. The lesson was driving home hard. Marcus had started the encounter thinking he was in control, only to discover that he had never been in control at all. Chun had been managing the entire situation from the moment Marcus approached him, guiding it toward a predetermined outcome while allowing the cadets to believe they were calling the shots. Senior Chief, is there anything else we should have done differently? Chun considered the question for a moment, his eyes scanning the assembled cadets. One thing. You approach this as an individual problem requiring an individual solution. But you're training to be military officers, which means you're training to lead teams. At what point did you consider the broader implications of your actions? Marcus realized he had never thought beyond the immediate confrontation. He hadn't considered how his aggressive approach might appear to visiting families, hadn't thought about the potential diplomatic consequences if he had been wrong about Chun being a threat, and hadn't considered how his actions might reflect on the academy as a whole. Never, Senior Chief. I focused on what I thought was an immediate threat without considering the bigger picture. That's a common mistake among junior leaders, Chun replied. The ability to see beyond the immediate tactical situation, to understand how your actions fit into larger strategic objectives, is what distinguishes good officers from great ones. The observation hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his eagerness to prove himself as a future military leader, he had demonstrated exactly the kind of tunnel vision that could prove disastrous in real combat situations. The irony was not lost on him that in trying to show his readiness for leadership responsibility, he had revealed how unprepared he actually was. But, as he stood there absorbing the weight of Chen's criticism, Marcus began to understand that this was exactly the point. The evaluation hadn't been designed to make him feel good about his current abilities. It had been designed to show him how much he still had to learn and to motivate him to become better. Chen seemed to sense his realization. Don't let this discourage you, cadet. The fact that you're thinking seriously about these issues puts you ahead of most people your age. The military needs officers who can learn from their mistakes and grow from constructive criticism. Marcus straightened his shoulders, feeling some of his confidence return. Senior Chief, will there be a formal evaluation report from this encounter? Chen's almost smile returned. There's always a report, cadet. But whether it reflects positively or negatively on you and your classmates will depend largely on what you do with the lessons you've learned here today. The implication was clear. This had been a test, and while Marcus wasn't sure he had passed it, he was being given an opportunity to demonstrate that he could profit from the experience. It was both a challenge and a chance for redemption. As the immediate shock of Chen's revelation began to wear off, Marcus found himself studying the SEAL with new eyes. What he had initially interpreted as suspicious behavior now revealed itself as the unconscious habits of a professional warrior. The way Chun positioned himself with clear sight lines and escape routes wasn't surveillance. It was survival instinct honed by years of operating in hostile environments. The casual confidence that had seemed arrogant was actually the bearing of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than an encounter with Academy cadets. Senior Chief, Marcus said, his voice steadier now as his military training reasserted itself. May I ask how long you've been observing our unit? Chun checked his watch, a simple black digital model that looked like it had seen plenty of hard use. About 3 weeks. This is my 4th visit to the Academy this month, and the first time any cadet has noticed my presence and taken action. The statement hit Marcus like a cold splash of water. 3 weeks. Chun had been walking through their facility, observing their routines, testing their awareness, and not a single cadet had noticed until today. Marcus wasn't sure if that made his squad look competent for finally spotting something amiss or incompetent for taking so long to notice it. 4 visits, Marcus repeated. Were you conducting the same kind of evaluation each time? Different aspects, Chun replied. Physical security protocols, personnel awareness, response times, chain of command procedures. Today was focused specifically on threat identification and response escalation. Cadet Peterson stepped forward, apparently emboldened by the increasingly educational tone of the conversation. Senior Chief, when you say personnel awareness, what exactly were you testing? Chun turned his attention to Peterson, and Marcus noticed how the SEAL's eyes seemed to catalog everything about his roommate in a single glance. Posture, uniform condition, confidence level, even the slight tremor in Peterson's voice that revealed his nervousness at addressing such a high-ranking special operator. I was observing how well the cadets understand their environment, Chun explained. Who belongs here and who doesn't? What constitutes normal behavior versus suspicious activity? How quickly unusual situations are identified and reported? Basic situational awareness skills that every military leader needs to develop. Marcus realized that Chin's answer raised more questions than it answered. Senior Chief, you mentioned this was your 4th visit, but you're obviously not trying to blend in completely, since you allowed yourself to be noticed today. What would have happened if we hadn't spotted you? The question seemed to please Chun, who nodded approvingly before answering. Good question. If none of the cadets had identified me as a potential concern, I would have approached one of your instructors and initiated contact myself. The evaluation would have continued, but the results would have been less favorable. The implication was clear. Today's encounter, embarrassing as it had been for Marcus, was actually a better outcome than the alternative. At least they had demonstrated some level of awareness and initiative, even if their execution had been flawed. But let's talk about what happened after you identified me as a potential threat, Chun continued. Walk me through your decision-making process, Cadet. What made you decide to approach me directly rather than alerting the duty officer or Academy security? Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks again. In the excitement of the moment, he had indeed bypassed the proper chain of command. Academy protocol called for suspicious activities to be reported to the duty officer, who would then coordinate any necessary response with appropriate security personnel. By taking direct action, Marcus had essentially appointed himself as security chief without authorization. I thought the situation required immediate action, Senior Chief. If you had been a genuine threat, taking time to report through channels might have allowed you to complete whatever objective you were pursuing. Chin nodded slowly. That's reasonable tactical thinking, but it raises some important questions about command structure and authority. In your future career as a military officer, when is it appropriate to bypass established protocols in favor of direct action? The question was clearly designed to make Marcus think about the broader implications of leadership and decision-making. It wasn't enough to identify problems and take action. Effective officers had to understand when their actions were appropriate and when they might cause more harm than good. I suppose it depends on the nature and immediacy of the threat, Marcus replied carefully. If there's immediate danger to personnel or critical assets, direct action might be justified. But in most situations, following established protocols ensures proper coordination and reduces the risk of friendly fire incidents or other mistakes. Very good, Chin said. Now apply that thinking to today's situation. Was there immediate danger that justified bypassing protocol? Marcus considered the question honestly. Chen had been walking around the facility for several minutes before the cadets approached him. He hadn't been moving toward any sensitive areas or attempting to access restricted facilities. His behavior, while unusual, hadn't indicated any imminent threat to personnel or property. No, Senior Chief. There was no immediate danger. I should have reported my concerns through proper channels and allowed Academy security to handle the investigation. And what might have been the consequences if I had actually been a hostile operative with genuine ill intent? The question forced Marcus to think through scenarios he had never seriously considered. A real terrorist or spy would likely be armed, trained, and prepared for confrontation. By approaching with a small group of cadets rather than coordinating with professional security personnel, Marcus could have inadvertently triggered a violent encounter that his team wasn't prepared to handle. We could have escalated a surveillance operation into an active combat situation without proper backup or coordination, Marcus admitted. If he had been armed and hostile, we might have gotten people killed unnecessarily. Chen's expression became more serious. That's exactly right. And that's why the military has protocols and chain of command structures. Individual initiative is valuable, but it has to be balanced against the need for coordinated professional responses to genuine threats. Cadet Kim, who had been listening intently, raised her hand tentatively. Senior Chief, how should we have handled the situation differently? Chun turned his attention to her, and Marcus noticed that his demeanor became slightly more encouraging when addressing Kim. Perhaps because she was asking about procedure rather than trying to justify past actions. Ideally, Chun said, one cadet should have continued observing the subject while another reported the suspicious behavior to the duty officer. That would have allowed for proper threat assessment while maintaining visual contact with the potential problem. A third cadet could have been positioned to provide backup observation from a different angle. The suggested approach made perfect sense, and Marcus realized it was exactly what they had been taught in their security training courses. In the heat of the moment, however, all that classroom instruction had been forgotten in favor of the more exciting option of direct confrontation. The duty officer would then have coordinated with Academy security to approach and question the individual using personnel with proper authority and training, Chin continued. If the situation had escalated, backup would have been immediately available, and the response would have been proportional to the actual threat level. Marcus absorbed the lesson, understanding now how his eagerness to prove himself had led him to make exactly the kind of mistake that could prove fatal in a real combat situation. The desire to be a hero had overridden his training and common sense. Senior Chief, Marcus said, is this kind of evaluation common in other military training programs? More common than you might think, Chin replied. Special operations units regularly test the readiness and awareness of conventional forces. We need to know what kind of support we can expect from different units and what kind of additional training might be necessary. The answer suggested that Marcus's encounter with Chun was part of a much larger evaluation process that extended beyond just the Naval Academy. The idea that elite military units were actively assessing the competence of their potential future colleagues added a new dimension to his understanding of military professionalism. The thing you need to understand, Chun continued, is that in special operations, we depend heavily on the quality of our supporting personnel. When we're inserted into hostile territory, we rely on intelligence officers, communications specialists, logistics coordinators, and unit commanders who may never see direct combat, but whose competence directly affects our survival. Marcus began to understand the broader significance of the day's events. This hadn't just been an abstract training exercise. It had been an assessment of his potential value as a future military leader who might one day be responsible for supporting SEAL operations. So our performance today could actually affect our future assignments? Peterson asked, clearly concerned about the implications. Chin's almost smile returned. Everything affects your future assignments, cadet. Every instructor evaluation, every peer review, every demonstration of leadership or failure of judgment becomes part of your military record. The question is whether you learn from experiences like today and use them to become better officers. The weight of constant evaluation was something Marcus had understood intellectually, but Experiencing it firsthand drove the lesson home in a way that no classroom instruction could have achieved. Every day, in ways both obvious and subtle, he was being assessed for his potential as a military leader. Senior Chief, can you tell us what qualities you look for when evaluating potential officer candidates? Chun considered the question for a moment, his eyes scanning the group of cadets who had gathered around their impromptu lesson. Adaptability is crucial, as we discussed earlier. But so is intellectual humility, the ability to recognize when you're wrong and adjust accordingly. Physical courage is important, but moral courage is even more critical. The willingness to make difficult decisions and accept responsibility for their consequences. Marcus realized that Chun was describing qualities that went far beyond basic military competence. These were the characteristics of leaders who could be trusted with the lives of the nation's most elite warriors. Most importantly, Chin continued, we look for people who understand that individual excellence means nothing without team success. The lone wolf mentality gets people killed in special operations. Everything we do depends on trust, coordination, and mutual support. The observation struck home for Marcus, who realized that his approach to the day's crisis had been fundamentally individualistic. He had seen a problem, appointed himself as the solution, and expected his teammates to fall in line behind his leadership. That might work in some situations, but it wasn't the kind of collaborative approach that special operations required. As Chun spoke, Marcus became increasingly aware that this encounter was changing his understanding of what it meant to be a military officer. It wasn't enough to be brave, competent, and decisive. Future leaders needed to be thoughtful, adaptive, and capable of seeing beyond their own immediate concerns to understand how their actions affected larger organizational objectives. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the academy about the unusual encounter taking place in the main courtyard. Marcus noticed several academy instructors maintaining a respectful distance, clearly aware of what was happening, but choosing to allow Chun to continue his impromptu education session. Other visitors had stopped their tours to listen, and even some senior cadets from upper classes had gathered to hear what a real Navy SEAL had to say about military leadership and tactics. Chun seemed comfortable with the attention, speaking with the natural authority of someone accustomed to training and mentoring younger personnel. Marcus realized that this was probably a significant part of the SEAL's regular duties, evaluating and developing future military leaders who might one day work alongside special operations units. Let me tell you something about the reality of military operations, Chun continued, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. In the movies, everything is clear-cut. Good guys, bad guys, obvious threats, simple solutions. But the real world operates in shades of gray, especially in modern asymmetric warfare. Marcus leaned forward, eager to hear insights that he knew weren't available in any textbook or classroom setting. This was first-hand knowledge from someone who had actually lived through the situations that Academy cadets only studied theoretically. Take Afghanistan, for example. Chun said, you might be working with local militia who are allies one day and enemies the next, depending on shifting tribal politics that you don't fully understand. You might encounter children carrying weapons or elderly civilians who are providing intelligence to hostile forces. Every situation requires rapid assessment and decision-making based on incomplete information. The description painted a picture of warfare that was far more complex and morally ambiguous than anything Marcus had previously considered. The neat tactical scenarios they practiced in training exercises suddenly seemed woefully inadequate preparation for the reality Chun was describing. In that environment, Chun continued, the ability to quickly distinguish between genuine threats and false positives becomes a matter of survival. Not just your own survival, but the survival of your entire team and potentially the success of the broader mission. Marcus began to understand how his encounter with Chun connected to these larger operational realities. His quick assumption that an unknown civilian represented a threat was exactly the kind of snap judgment that could prove disastrous in a complex operational environment. Senior Chief, asked Cadet Williams, who had just joined the group, how do you develop that kind of judgment? How do you learn to make those distinctions accurately under pressure? Chin's expression became thoughtful. Experience helps, but experience alone isn't enough. You need a systematic approach to threat assessment that doesn't rely on gut instinct or preconceived notions. You need to train yourself to observe objectively and think critically about what you're seeing. The SEAL paused and looked directly at Marcus. For example, what specific behaviors did you observe that led you to conclude I was a potential threat? Marcus thought back to his initial observations, trying to separate his actual perceptions from the assumptions he had built on top of them. You were walking alone when most visitors were in groups. You were studying the facility in a way that seemed different from normal tourist behavior. You positioned yourself near tactical landmarks like the memorial statue. Good, Chin said. Those are concrete, observable facts. Now, what alternative explanations could account for those same behaviors? The question forced Marcus to think creatively about interpretations he had never considered. You could have been a former military member who was naturally interested in security arrangements. You might have been separated from a tour group and try to catch up. You could have been conducting an evaluation of cadet readiness. Chin nodded approvingly. Exactly. The behaviors you observed were accurate, but your interpretation of their meaning was limited by your assumptions about what threats look like and how they behave. Marcus realized that this was a fundamental issue with his approach to problem solving. He had been trained to identify threats, but not to consider the full range of possible explanations for suspicious behavior. It was a form of tunnel vision that could prove dangerous in operational settings. This connects to a broader issue in military thinking, Chen continued. We often prepare for the threats we expect rather than the threats we might actually face. We develop countermeasures for last war's challenges rather than next war's realities. The observation resonated with Marcus, who remembered studying historical examples of military organizations that had prepared extensively for conflicts that never materialized while being caught off guard by unexpected challenges. In special operations, we try to cultivate what we call cognitive flexibility, Chen explained. The ability to rapidly shift between different interpretive frameworks, depending on changing circumstances. It's not enough to be good at identifying one type of threat. You need to be able to recognize and adapt to entirely new categories of challenges. Cadet Kim raised her hand. Senior Chief, how do you maintain that flexibility when you're under extreme stress? Doesn't pressure naturally make people fall back on their most familiar responses? Chin's expression became more serious, and Marcus sensed they were getting into material that touched on Chin's actual combat experience. That's exactly right, Cadet. Stress and fatigue naturally reduce cognitive flexibility and make people default to their most ingrained habits. That's why training is so important, but it has to be the right kind of training. The SEAL looked around the assembled group, as if assessing their readiness to hear more advanced material. Most military training focuses on developing automatic responses to specific scenarios. See Threat A, Execute Response B. That's useful for basic tactical situations, but it breaks down when you encounter threats that don't fit your predetermined categories. Marcus realized that this was exactly what had happened during his encounter with Chun. He had seen behavior that didn't fit the normal visitor pattern, immediately categorized it as threatening, and executed the standard response protocol without considering alternative interpretations. Special operations training tries to develop what we call adaptive expertise, Chun continued. Instead of just learning specific responses to specific threats, you learn to rapidly analyze novel situations and develop appropriate responses in real time. The concept was fascinating, and Marcus could see how it would apply beyond military contexts. The ability to adapt and improvise in unexpected situations would be valuable in any leadership role. Can you give us an example of how that works in practice? Peterson asked. Shouldn't consider the question for a moment. I could give you a general example without going into operational details. Imagine you're conducting a reconnaissance mission in an urban environment, and you encounter a checkpoint that wasn't there during your mission planning. Your automatic response might be to abort the mission and return to base. The assembled cadets nodded, recognizing this as standard procedure for unexpected complications. But adaptive thinking would consider multiple options, Chen continued. Can the checkpoint be bypassed without compromising the mission? Can you gather intelligence about why it was established and whether it represents a genuine change in enemy capabilities. Can you use the checkpoint's presence to gain information about enemy movement patterns or priorities? Marcus began to understand how this approach would require a fundamentally different mindset from the rule-based thinking that dominated most military training. Instead of following predetermined procedures, adaptive expertise required constant analysis and creative problem-solving. The key is developing comfort with uncertainty, Chen explained. Most people, including most military personnel, prefer clear guidelines and predictable outcomes. But special operations requires you to function effectively in situations where the rules are unclear and the outcomes are uncertain. The observation struck Marcus as particularly relevant to his own career development. His entire military education had been focused on learning and following established procedures, but Chen was describing a level of leadership that required going beyond procedural knowledge to develop genuine strategic thinking. Senior Chief, Marcus said, how do you develop that comfort with uncertainty? How do you train people to think adaptively rather than just follow procedures? Chen's almost smile returned. Good question. Part of it is experiential. You need to be placed in situations where your normal procedures don't work, so you're forced to improvise and adapt. That's part of what happened here today. Marcus realized that his encounter with Chun had indeed been exactly that kind of training experience. His normal approach to security threats hadn't been adequate for the situation, forcing him to think more creatively about threat assessment and response protocols. But experience alone isn't enough, Chun continued. You also need to develop what we call mental models, frameworks for understanding how different types of systems and organizations work. The more mental models you have available, the better equipped you are to understand and respond to novel situations. The concept reminded Marcus of his strategic studies courses, which had introduced him to various theories about international relations, organizational behavior, and conflict dynamics. At the time, those theoretical frameworks had seemed abstract and disconnected from practical military concerns, but Chen was describing them as essential tools for operational effectiveness. For example, Chen said, understanding how tribal societies organize themselves is crucial for operations in Afghanistan or Africa. Understanding how criminal networks function is important for counterterrorism work. Understanding how bureaucracies make decisions is essential for working within large military organizations. Marcus began to see how the broad liberal arts education required at the Naval Academy connected to the practical demands of military leadership. The goal wasn't just to create technically competent officers, but to develop leaders who could understand and operate effectively within complex social and political environments. The other crucial element is what we call intellectual humility, Chen continued. The willingness to admit when you're wrong, to change your mind when presented with new evidence, to seek input from people who know more than you do about specific subjects. The emphasis on humility seemed paradoxical to Marcus, who had always associated military leadership with confidence and decisive action. But Chen was describing a more sophisticated approach to leadership that combined confidence in one's own abilities with recognition of one's limitations. In special operations, ego gets people killed, Chen said bluntly. The most dangerous operators are the ones who think they have all the answers, who aren't willing to listen to input from local sources or technical experts or junior personnel who might have crucial information. Marcus thought about his own approach to the day's crisis, realizing that pride and ego had indeed played a role in his decision-making. He had wanted to prove himself as a leader, to demonstrate his competence and authority. Those motivations had led him to take action without fully considering alternatives or consulting with others who might have different perspectives. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the academy courtyard, Marcus realized that this encounter with Senior Chief Chun had fundamentally changed his understanding of military leadership and his own potential as an officer. What had started as an embarrassing confrontation had evolved into the most valuable learning experience of his cadet career. Chun checked his watch again, the same practical timepiece that had witnessed countless operations in places Marcus could only imagine. I need to wrap up my evaluation here and report back to my command, but before I go, let me leave you with a few final thoughts. The assembled crowd of cadets and visitors grew quiet, sensing that Chun was about to share something important. Marcus found himself leaning forward, not wanting to miss any element of what he instinctively knew would be crucial guidance for his future development as a military leader. The most important lesson from today isn't about threat assessment or security protocols, Chun began. It's about the difference between reactive and proactive leadership. Reactive leaders respond to situations as they develop. Proactive leaders shape situations to create the outcomes they want. Marcus reflected on his own behavior during the encounter, recognizing that he had been entirely reactive from the beginning. He had noticed unusual behavior, reacted with suspicion, and then followed a predetermined response pattern without considering how he might shape the situation to achieve better outcomes. When you first noticed me, you had several options, Chun continued. You could have simply continued observing to gather more information. You could have positioned your team to maintain surveillance while reporting through proper channels. You could have approached me in a non-confrontational manner to determine my purpose here. Each alternative that Chun described would have been more sophisticated than Marcus's chosen approach. Instead of immediately escalating to a security confrontation, he could have managed the situation to gather information and maintain options for various responses. Instead, you chose the most dramatic and least flexible option, Chun said. You essentially forced the situation into a binary outcome. Either I was a threat that needed to be neutralized, or I wasn't. That approach eliminates opportunities for creative solutions and learning. The criticism stung, but Marcus recognized its accuracy. His approach had indeed been crude and inflexible, more focused on demonstrating authority than on gathering information or solving problems. In special operations, we prefer approaches that maintain maximum flexibility while gathering maximum information, Chun explained. We want to understand situations thoroughly before committing to specific courses of action. Premature commitment to a particular interpretation or response limits your options if circumstances change. Marcus realized that this principle applied far beyond military tactics. In any complex situation, whether professional or personal, maintaining flexibility while gathering information would lead to better outcomes than rushing to judgment and action. But there's something else I want you to understand, Chun continued, his tone becoming more personal. The fact that you made mistakes today doesn't disqualify you from future leadership roles. Everyone makes mistakes, including experienced special operators. The question is whether you learn from them and use them to become more effective. The encouragement meant more to Marcus than he could express. Coming from someone with Chen's credentials and experience, it suggested that today's errors were not career-ending disasters, but rather normal parts of a learning process. I've been evaluating military personnel for over a decade, Chun said, and I can tell you that the ones who become truly effective leaders are rarely the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who make mistakes early, learn from them completely, and use those lessons to develop better judgment and decision-making skills. Cadet Peterson stepped forward. Senior Chief, what's the most important quality for someone who wants to serve in special operations? Chun considered the question carefully before answering. Mental toughness is crucial, but not the kind you might think. Physical courage is important, but it's relatively common. The kind of mental toughness that special operations requires is the ability to function effectively despite uncertainty, ambiguity, and incomplete information. The description resonated with Marcus, who realized that his discomfort with uncertainty had contributed to his hasty decision-making during their encounter. Rather than remaining comfortable with not knowing Chen's purpose, he had rushed to resolve the ambiguity through direct confrontation. Most people, when faced with uncertain situations, experience psychological pressure to reduce that uncertainty as quickly as possible, Chun continued. They make premature decisions or jump to conclusions because the discomfort of not knowing feels worse than the risk of being wrong. Marcus recognized this pattern in his own behavior. The uncertainty about Chen's presence had created psychological pressure that led him to choose action over analysis, confrontation over investigation. But in special operations, you have to become comfortable with uncertainty, Chun said. You have to be able to operate effectively while acknowledging that you don't have all the information you need, that your initial assumptions might be wrong, and that circumstances might change in ways you haven't anticipated. The skill Chan was describing seemed almost philosophical in nature, requiring a fundamental shift in how someone approached decision-making and problem-solving. It wasn't just about learning new tactics or procedures, but about developing a different relationship with knowledge and uncertainty. That brings me to my final point, Chen said. Military leadership, especially at the higher levels, is fundamentally about managing complexity and uncertainty. The technical skills you learn here at the Academy are important, but they're just the foundation. The real challenge is developing the judgment and wisdom to apply those skills effectively in situations that don't match your training scenarios. Marcus realized that Chun was describing exactly the kind of leadership he aspired to develop. The ability to navigate complex situations with confidence and effectiveness, even when facing unprecedented challenges or incomplete information. Chun reached into his pocket again, this time producing a simple business card. He handed it to Marcus, who noticed that it contained only Chen's name, rank, and a phone number. No unit designation or specific contact information that might compromise operational security. If any of you decide to pursue special operations careers, that number will connect you with our personnel development office, Chen said. But don't contact them until you've had at least 2 years of fleet experience. We need officers who understand conventional military operations before they try to master unconventional warfare. The gesture represented more than just career advice. It was an indication that Chun saw potential in the cadets despite their mistakes, that today's errors hadn't disqualified them from consideration for elite military service. Remember, Chun continued, every officer in special operations started exactly where you are now, as inexperienced cadets trying to figure out what military leadership actually means. The difference between those who succeed and those who don't isn't natural talent or physical ability. It's the willingness to continuously learn, adapt, and improve. Marcus pocketed the business card carefully, treating it as both a valuable opportunity and a reminder of the standards he would need to meet to earn consideration for special operations service. One last thing, Chun said, his expression becoming serious. Today's encounter will be included in your permanent academic records, along with my assessment of how you handled the situation. But that assessment will focus primarily on how you respond to the lessons you've learned here, not on the initial mistakes you made. The statement carried both promise and warning. Marcus understood that his future evaluations would be influenced by whether he demonstrated growth and learning from this experience. Senior Chief, Marcus said, is there anything specific we should focus on to improve our performance in future situations like this? Chen nodded approvingly at the question. Develop your observation skills. Practice making detailed, objective descriptions of what you see before jumping to conclusions about what it means. Study different cultural and organizational contexts so you have more mental models available when you encounter unfamiliar situations. And most importantly, cultivate intellectual humility. The more you learn, the more you'll realize how much you don't know. As Chun prepared to leave, Marcus felt compelled to offer one final comment. Senior Chief, thank you for turning what could have been a disciplinary situation into a learning opportunity. This has been more valuable than months of classroom instruction. Chen's almost smile became a genuine grin for the first time during their encounter. That's what good leaders do, Cadet. They turn problems into opportunities, mistakes into lessons, and conflicts into growth experiences. Remember that when you're the senior officer dealing with junior personnel who make errors in judgment. With that final piece of wisdom, Chun walked away, moving with the same purposeful confidence that at first attracted Marcus's attention. But now Marcus understood that the confidence came not from arrogance or aggression, but from the deep competence and experience that only came from years of successful service in the world's most demanding military environment. As the crowd dispersed and the cadets returned to their regular duties, Marcus remained in the courtyard for a few additional minutes, processing everything that had happened. The encounter with Chun had been humbling, educational, and ultimately inspiring. It had shown him how much he still needed to learn, but also provided a roadmap for that learning and development. Looking down at the business card in his hand, Marcus made a silent commitment to himself. He would use the lessons from today to become the kind of officer that Chun and other special operators could respect and trust. It would require years of dedicated effort and continuous self-improvement, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, Marcus felt like he truly understood what that effort would need to accomplish. The man who had seemed like a threat that morning had turned out to be one of the most valuable teachers Marcus had ever encountered. The question, "Do you even know who I am?" would continue to resonate with him throughout his military career, serving as a reminder that initial appearances could be deceiving, that assumptions could be dangerous, and that true leadership required the humility to recognize how much he still needed to learn.